something like a Cambrian explosion going on with the synthesis of intelligence, the synthesis of human decision initiating intelligence, and then machine intelligences that are intention implementing. Now, what I want to do is to make just 3 simple points today, and that is based on some Buddhist reflections that take a relational ontology to be crucially important to getting at the ethical dimensions of what's going on with intelligent technology. These 3 points is that our ethical engagement with synthetic intelligence is being hampered by our presupposition that the basic units of ethical analysis are ontologically distinct agents, actions, and patients. But addressing the risks and the rewards of intelligent technology or synthetic intelligence is going to depend on making a critical distinction between tools and technologies. And finally, that the greatest risk of intelligent technology for humanity is not a technological singularity, it's an ethical singularity. Our arrival point where the opportunity space collapses for intelligent human course correction. So I want to come at it from a Buddhist perspective, and for the purpose of an audience that doesn't have any background familiarity with Buddhism, I'll just say, let's reduce Buddhism to 2 insights. One, that everything arises interdependently, that there are no fundamental units of reality, that everything is relational first and foremost, that relationality is more basic than things related. And finally, that everything ultimately is only what it means for other things. The second insight is that there are 2 kinds of causality and temporality. A kind of causality and temporality that has to do with linear sequential relations, and another kind of causality and temporality that has to do with immaterial, nonlinear significance relations. And within a Buddhist context, that's referred to as karma. So karma is the interplay, the diffractive interplay of 2 different kinds of causality and temporality. And according to the teaching of karma, whatever it is that we're experiencing is a result of consistent patterns of our own values, intentions, and actions. That's what determines the kind of relational outcomes and opportunities that we experience. In other words, our worlds are elicited by the kinds of values and intentions that we enact. So taken together, these insights suggest a real rethinking of the relationship that we have with technology, between the non-duality of the ontological and the axiological realms, that is, the realms of matter and what matters. We need to rethink consciousness in the human world relationship because their relationship is more like the relationship of the 2 sides or edges of a Mobius strip. If you look at a strip like this, it looks like there's 2 edges and 2 sides. In fact, there's not. It's a 3-dimensional figure that has 1 side and 1 edge. And I want to suggest that matter and what matters, that's the physical and the phenomenal, are related in much the same way topologically as the 2 sides, supposedly, apparently 2 sides or 2 edges of the Mobius strip. So what this has to do with technology is that we normally tend to reduce, because we have this smallest bias toward there being individual fundamental units of reality, whether they're individual subatomic particles or forces or what have you, we tend to assume that individuals are basic. And that leads us to misidentify technologies with the tools that are used as a part of it. Tools are localizable artifacts. They're things ultimately. We make use of tools for specific sets of purposes, and we can evaluate tools based on their task-specific utility. With tools, very importantly, we have exit rights. We can decide not to use tools, how to use tools, whether and when to use the tools. I'm going to suggest that technologies are rather different. Technologies are non-localizable relational systems that transform what we do, how, and why. In fact, we do not build or construct or use technologies. We participate in technologies. Technologies emerge out of systematic human material and conceptual practices in much the same way that ecosystems emerge out of the relationships among species. Once ecosystems and species begin co-emerging, they influence one another. The recursion is taking place all the time, so that ecosystems, once they start to emerge, begin to inform the interactions of species, and in the same way species are interacting with those ecosystems and determining the evolutionary path of the ecosystems. So we're involved in technologies in much the same way that species are within ecosystems. To kind of see how this plays out in terms of the importance of getting at the ethical issues that are raised by technology, especially intelligent technology, look at the human in the loop phenomenon. So the human in the loop is putting a human between the observing, orienting, decision-making parts of this process and the decision implementing part of the process, the last causal stage of it. And that works. It's a good precaution to address issues of machine autonomy, to make sure that the kinds of decisions that autonomous systems are making, say an autonomous weapon system, are actually in accord with what a human would do under the similar circumstances. What's presumed here is that the human that's in the loop retains evaluative independence and freedom of intention. And in other words, we have an essentially external or contingent relationship with that tool. Now, the conceit of independence, I think, is not tenable when humans cease to be in the loop and instead become functionally integral loops within intelligent technology as a dynamically evolving relational medium. And this is happening in part because over the last quarter century or so, there's been a displacement, a supplanting of a 19th and 20th century attention economy in which mass advertising was used to attract and exploit human attention to generate revenue, to a system now where human beings, all of us that are users of digital search, digital recommendation programs, e-commerce, et cetera, we're all now doing double duty. We're no longer external from the system. We are consumers of individually targeted goods and services, but we're also producers of the training data for the systems that are expanding processes of attention, capture, and control. What that means is that while we may presume ourselves to continue operating within intelligent technology as individuals, if we do that, we'll see ourselves as ontologically independent and we'll say, well, what's this double duty about? If we persist in seeing ourselves as individuals, it looks as if we could explain it as, well, all that we're doing is we're participating in a free exchange. We're giving our individual data to these platform operators in order for them to produce systems to give us the kinds of things that we're asking for. They increases our choices, our options are going to be preferable and so on. It's a good deal. Or it could be framed alternatively as, look, this is a predatory labor practice that's part of surveillance capitalism. And either way, whether you take it's the innocuous value-free exchange, or you see it as a really predatory practice, either way, as long as we assume that the individual is the basic unit of analysis, then it's just a technical problem. All we need to do is figure out how to ensure privacy in the first case, or in the second case, how to map the kinds of revenue streams from data generation to data exploitation, and to make sure that individuals are given their due just reserves. So very nice, but what if we are not? What if we are not individuals? What if we are in fact implemented within this system? What if we're participating in this medium of intelligent technology? And I think it looks rather different, because every time a machine learning system gets greater epistemic powers to be able to predict our behaviors, our beliefs, our powers, our desires, our fears, they're also yielding similarly unprecedented ontic powers to produce behaviors and beliefs, affecting how we relate and how freely we relate. So through our participation within these systems, what we were effectively doing is risking forfeiting our most basic human freedoms, our most basic rights and freedoms, which are the rights to freedom of attention and freedom of intention. I want to suggest that consciousness matters in this. We had some mention of consciousness yesterday. From a Buddhist perspective, consciousness is not the property of an organism. It's not something that arises through relations of an individually previously existing organism and its environment, an external objective environment. Rather, consciousness consists in the coherent differentiation of organisms and their environments, or sensing presences and sensed presences. So the body-brain environment relations are elaborations of an infrastructure of consciousness. They're materializations of what consciousness does. Consciousness is not a thing. It doesn't exist in a thing like matter. Consciousness is a relational dynamic that performs things in the world. And what it performs is coherent differentiation. So consciousness is evolution, or evolution is consciousness mattering, that we cannot separate out consciousness from what's going on material around the world. So this is a Buddhist perspective. There is, however, some evidence to support this neuroscientifically. We have evidence that if you're looking at what's happening in psychedelic experiences and meditative experiences, what's most valued in those experiences, as documented in first-person reporting on the experiences, correlates with third-person measurements neuroscientifically through brain imaging of increased brain entropy. What that suggests is that these very valued experiences from meditation and from psychedelic use are not important, valuable for neural reasons. Their importance is not intracranial. Their importance is extracranial. And it connects with theorizing of consciousness that sees what's going on with consciousness as dissolving the default mode network that is a part of the neurological system that supports sort of ego or self-supporting narratives that in Buddhism would be theorized as the work of the seventh consciousness, sort of subjective consciousness. We can get into Buddhism and 8 consciousnesses later. But basically what we're doing in these psychedelic and meditative experiences is dissolving habits of thought, feeling, and action that normally constrain our ability to pay attention and that limit our responsiveness. So in a sense, what's going on in these experiences is that we're minimizing, consciousness is minimizing relational entropy by enhancing ecological differentiation and our responsiveness, our ability to create different forms of coherence. So third point is that interbrain entanglement is affected by what we think or expect to be truth. There are these very, very insightful experiments that have been done where humans engage in collaborative tasks. And when you engage in collaborative tasks, neural systems, brainwave systems, those patterns coordinate. That's only happening when you are collaborating, not when you're competing. Interesting first point. Second point, when people are given the task to collaborate with one another, they're doing it online through a computer interface, and they're told sometimes you're working with a human, sometimes you're working with an AI. In the cases where they believe they're working with another human, both humans, their brainwaves coordinate. If they think that they're working with an AI, instead, their brainwaves don't coordinate, even though they're always working with a human being. And what this suggests is that interbrain entanglement is going on through collaborative dynamics that are consciousness-based, that it's our intentionality, what we believe and what we think that is affecting the neural structure. So consciousness has causal agency. It has causal reality. So unlike the physicalist reductionists who would say that consciousness doesn't have any more causal relevance than the report of a gun being shot does on the trajectory of a bullet, that consciousness actually is causally relevant. What we believe, what we think is causally relevant. How are our beliefs shaped? Well, partly by consciousness itself. We engage one another through shared interaction and communication and so on, but just in the same way that transportation infrastructure can limit what you can do in terms of transportation, we follow the streets, the roads, the paths. Once conscious infrastructure has been developed, we tend to follow that. Intelligent technology is implicating us in developing a new kind of infrastructure for consciousness, which will both in some ways liberate and in some ways constrain human agency. So what's going on, I think, with intelligent technology, wittingly or unwittingly, is mass experimentation and hacking the infrastructure of consciousness. Using machine learning tools to predict and produce behaviors is ethically analogous to inserting brain electrodes into the brain to manipulate human behavior. You know that you can put electrodes in the brain and get people to have an arm go up. And people will say, when asked, why did your arm go up? They will answer, I wanted to scratch my hair, scratch my head. Because there's nothing in the evolutionary development of this infrastructure of human consciousness that could explain how your hand moved up by itself. So what the system wants to say is, I must have been responsible for that. Reductionists have looked at that as proof. Brain first, consciousness second, consciousness causally irrelevant. But these studies that I've just cited show that that's not the case. Consciousness is in fact causally irrelevant, so that when we're hacking the infrastructure of consciousness, whether it's the brain infrastructure or neural infrastructure, the body environment relationship infrastructure, or the cultural patterns that we're participating in, where culture is also an external infrastructure for consciousness and especially for shared consciousness. Now, what's going on with these machine learning tools is it's the equivalent of inserting algorithmic electrodes into the connective tissue of shared human consciousness. So someone might object to that. Well, look, we could just change the objective function of the machine learning systems. Instead of extracting, holding, and exploiting human attention, why don't we design machine learning systems that will figure out what is entailed in compassionate behavior, for example, compassionate relations, and we can have that be the objective function, and realize systems that will allow us to all enjoy compassionate relations with one another, to increase that, to get that part of what's hardwired into the infrastructure of human consciousness. Might sound like a good idea, but I think we have to be really worried about ironic consequences, because it brings to mind the specter of past projects in eugenics, and with the very, very difficult question of asking, well, if we were to do that, if we were going to engineer ourselves to be human, if we're going to engineer ourselves to be ethical by design, then whose ethics? From which time period? According to which culture? Which historical era? Is the present time period, and this is a real question about ethics, is ethics fixed? Or should ethics be an improvisational art in which we're all engaged? The improvisational, the evaluative art of changing human choruses in ways that are responsive to our environments and in ways that are conducive, in Buddhist terms, to living in relational dynamics that are less conflicted, less troubled, and full of less suffering. Thank you. There's a nice image to end.
That's great. Thanks so much, Peter. And next up, we have Smita from UC Berkeley.